If you're watching this, you probably want to know how to assemble an RXB250L. Alright, now when you receive your box, make sure you open it up and inspect for damage before you sign for it. This one looks pretty good. The only damage we found was a little scuff on the front fender. Now in this manila envelope, that's your MCO. You take that with your bill of sale to get your registration and title. Now this little bracket, that is for your headlight. Make sure you put that aside. Do not lose that. Now some of the items that will be on the outside taped or zip tied will be the front disc guard, your bar pad. In the box, that's your rear view mirrors, your front shrouds, and it comes with a number plate. So if you want to just run moto and not be street legal, that's included. Now I am by no means an expert, but I do have about 35 or 40 years of riding and wrenching, and I've never taken my bike in for service. I've done everything myself. Once you get it open, you'll find the front fender hidden above the rear tire and the rear taillight. Go ahead and just disconnect that taillight. It's all color coded, so don't worry about screwing something up. Leave the bike bolted to the bottom frame. It's much easier to slide around. Now this is where you get a friend and get it up on the bike stand. First thing we'll do is pack the headset bearings. Go ahead and loosen the pinch bolts and take the nut on the top of the tree out. And after that you can slide the forks out with a little bit of wiggling and assistance. Do the same for both sides. And go ahead and pull the triple tree off and tap that retaining nut off. Now you'll notice it's probably going to be dry, if any grease at all. Now grab your gloves and some grease and start packing bearings. The bottom one was pressed on, so I'm just using my finger to press the grease all the way down into the rollers. The top one is much easier to deal with. Just pack it like a normal wheel bearing. Keep compressing it until you see it starting to ooze out of the top, and use as much as you want. Just keep packing it in there and make a mess. Now don't over tighten this. You just want to make sure the bearings are seated all the way in the race and there's no slop. If you feel any resistance in turning, you need to back off a little bit. Now this is where you get your first taste of Loctite. This is the bottom of the ignition, and it's on under the tree. Go ahead and goop some Loctite in there while you're right there, and it's easy to access. On mine, this did loosen up, and I lost one of the spacers. Go ahead and put the tree back on, and the retaining nut. Torque specs on this are, I can't find any torque specs on the bike, so just use your own judgment. On the bottom left fork leg, you'll find two bags. One of them has your front axle and your bar risers. Now you can use these in one of two ways. Position the bars about a half an inch forward or back, so this is personal preference. Now don't tighten these up all the way until you get the bars mounted. It's just easier to line things up that way. Now go ahead and snug up the risers Then align your fork tubes so your air blade are both pointing forward, and snug up all the pinch bolts. Pop off the clutch cable, and use any quality cable lube, and even WD-40 works in a pinch. You just need to get some lubrication down in the cable. Once the cable's popped back on, you can adjust the clutch, and you want to get the majority of your adjustment in the bottom adjuster, and then you can fine tune it with the perch adjuster. Just leave it a little bit of slack. Disassemble the throttle housing and remove the throttle tube. You need to put some lubrication on the bar. A lot of people use grease, but it ends up getting sand and grit stuck in it, so I use a dry graphite lube, and it's always worked well. And while you're at it, get it down in the ignition. The Chinese ignitions do not work well unless they're lubed. Go ahead and bolt all this back together. And while you're at it, spray some lube down inside the throttle cable. When bolting on the instrument cluster, be sure to put a little Loctite. These are also known to vibrate loose. Be sure to use dielectric grease on every connector on the bike. Right now we'll just do all the ones in the front. The front fender is pretty straightforward. The only thing you want to make sure is that you put the bracket on the outside of the front two bolts. Be sure to tuck your CDI in all the way to the back and bundle all your wires to the right side. This is so the headlight adjuster can clear. If you have a mismatch of wires, you'll never get your headlighting proper. Install the turn signals. Now they are the pivot point for the front headlight housing. And remember, blue on the right, orange on the left. And don't forget to use dielectric grease on these connectors. Okay, on the front wheel. Lube the brake caliper pin and slide that on, and also loosen up the front brake cable. That the hose that runs up, you'll need to readjust that at this point. Loosen up the speedometer pickup and get that out of the way. Loosen both pinch bolts on the bottom of the fork, and also make sure the brake pads are open. Oh, and a tip: do not ever pull the front brake lever until the wheel is on. Now the front spacers, one is slightly longer. The longer one will go on the non-rotor side. The most important part here is understanding the front axle nut does not tighten the wheel on the bike. The front axle nut is only tightening the axle to the hub. The pinch bolts hold the axle on the bike. To tighten that axle, tighten the pinch bolts on the right side, then torque the axle down, and tighten the left side pinch bolts. Now go back to the other side again and loosen them. You'll compress the forks 2 or 3 times, and that'll align the fork leg, and then tighten it back up. Now you'll have to do this once the bike's on the ground to do the final adjustment. Adjust the speedo pickup so there's about 1/4 of an inch gap. Now adjust your suspension clickers on the bottom of the fork to the center on both right and left, and also the top. You want to go in the very middle. You can fine tune those later. Well, that completes the front of the bike. Now we'll move on to the air filter. As you can see, the filter is shipped with just a little bit of oil sprayed on it. This is not how you oil a dirt bike air filter. So we're going to pull this out and properly oil it. The easiest way I found is just fill a Ziploc bag with filter oil, squish it around, and then squeeze out the excess. Do not wring the air filter out, and then set it aside to dry. Remove the Allen bolt under the rear fender. That will allow the seat to be removed. I always screw it back in the seat so I don't misplace it. Black is negative, red is positive. I hope everyone knows that. And turn your ignition on. Go ahead and test your signal. Blinkers don't hit the starter yet. Hold down the right button, turn the ignition on. This will switch it to miles per hour from kilometers. Now hold both down and turn the ignition on. Then hold the left one, and you'll go into program mode. You want to change those numbers to 2114, and then hold the left button to lock it in. That's going to calibrate the speedometer. This Kickstarter is an absolute joke. Just take it off. Now pop the fuel line and remove the bolt in the center of the tank. The reason we're taking this off is A, easier access, and B, there's usually plastic shavings. This one was clean, but the other two I built were full. Take this time to get to all the connectors under the tank with dielectric grease. Remove the double nuts on the exhaust flange. And then remove the 2 bolts holding on the exhaust. Move that out of the way. I don't know what kind of exhaust gasket that is, but throw it away. Remove both hose clamps on the boots for the carburetor. There's one in the front and back. You can get your fingers in here and pull it off the back of the carburetor. And you can unscrew the slide. And be careful with this and put it off to the side. Now from the other side, you can wiggle the carb out gently. Remove both screws off the bottom of the float bowl. And in the very center will be your main jet. Now go ahead and replace that with the proper one for your elevation. And in front of that is the pilot jet. That's for idle and low speed. I can't really go into much more detail. It's a video on its own. But this just shows you the basic of replacing the pilot and the main jet. Now this slide goes in only one way. There's an indexing pin on the side of the bore. So be careful not to mar the slide or the bore. Now work the filter back on the frame. Some people use a rim grease around the perimeter. I haven't in years. It caused more mess than I think good. And the inside of my filters have always been clean. So as long as you oil them properly, you won't have a problem. Go ahead and reinstall the cover. Go ahead and pop the tank back on and put the bolt in. Now this is where you will put a new copper crush gasket in, and not that slinky contraption. Now stick the head pipe into the head. And put a couple nuts on the flange. You will need to double nut these. If you do not know what double nutting is, Google it. You might get a few interesting results, but there is one mechanical answer you're looking for. Now use an old shoestring to pull the springs on and connect all of the springs to the kickstand and then push the kickstand into place. You'll have to wiggle it around to get the bolt in, but be sure you Loctite that. Loosen the large rear axle nut and then these smaller tension adjusters. You're going to have those on either side. The reason you are loosening the chain is you won't be able to get the suspension link out on the next step. Not shown here is attaching the shock to the linkage. You'll need a second person to lift the rear swing arm and line that bolt up. Tighten the adjuster so you have about a 1/4 to 1/8 inch of vertical play in the chain, and then use the indentations on the swing arm on the other side to match up the wheel alignment. And go ahead and snug down the lock nut. Now, spoke adjustment is another one of those topics that requires its own video. But the basics: go around the wheel and look for any obvious loose spokes and try to bring the tension equal to the one around it. And then work your way around the wheel, only going 1/8 of a turn at a time. Continue around the wheel 2 or 3 times until they're all snug, and repeat on the back wheel. If you do it like this, you will not have to retrue the wheel or minimize it. But then again, go to a more detailed video if you want to balance and true your wheels. Mounting the taillight is pretty straightforward. Use dielectric grease on all the connectors, and I like to wrap everything with electrical tape. I do not use shrink wrap here because it just makes maintenance easier. Drilling this hole is optional. It just makes access to the clicker adjustment easier. At this point, go ahead and set this clicker in the middle position, as well as the one on the bottom of the shock. Fine tuning can be done later. Turn the kill switch off and turn the engine over a few times. This will allow the oil to prime and get a little bit of oil up to the valve train. Go ahead and turn the choke on and hit the starter. At this point, you'll need to adjust the idle and be careful that the head pipe gets hot fairly quickly. Now just follow the manufacturer's break-in procedure and enjoy!